Hey, my name is David Bowler. I'm a 30-year veteran of the comic books, gaming, and animation industry, and today I want to talk with you about the top 5 video game comics I actually worked on. Now, video game comics, and just generally comics, video games, and movies have this very strange relationship. On one hand, there's a lot of video games who drew inspiration from movies. On the other hand, there was always comic mates of video games, and they really never really took off. The only video game comic that I can see stand on its own and actually was really successful was Sonic the Hedgehog. But there is a plethora, there's a ton of other comics. Almost every video game has at some point some kind of a comic. Now, I was very heavily involved in Eidos comics, back at the time. That was about the year 2000, 1999, 2000. So let's quickly go over the list. I'll show you some examples and have a little few anecdotes, because there's actually a couple really interesting games that end up being sort of like cult classics for sometimes better or sometimes worse. The number 5 comic is Killer Instinct. Now, Killer Instinct isn't a major game. It was sort of like a fighter game in the vein of like Street Fighters, as far as I understand. I was working for some stuff of Acclaim at the time. Acclaim was a video game company that bought a comic book publisher called Valiant, mostly for some of its IP. I think they released like a Turok, what was it called, Dinosaur Hunter, something like that later on. But they also published some comics from other companies. The Killer Instinct, I think, was from Midway or Nintendo or something like that. And I did a few issues for that. Probably not one of my favorite jobs, I mean, it is what it is. I'll show you some of the artwork, and I think some of the quality art and some of the inking was okay, but it's definitely not something that my heart was completely in it. Number 4, Fear Effect. Now, Fear Effect was actually the last comic I did for Eidos Top Cow at the time, that came on the heels of the other ones that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Fear Effect was distinct because it had a very clear anime manga style, and I remember them calling me at the time and say, well, David, can you draw that kind of style? Now, of course, I had been a long manga anime fan forever. My best friend as a kid was Japanese, so I sort of grew up in that household where there's Tezuka comic books and Tezuka manga, everywhere. I watched religiously anime as a kid, Came by White Lion, Battle of the Planets, all that stuff, basically. I loved it. So, I had some kind of a little bit experience with it, and much later on I would actually draw legitimately manga stuff, but this was preceding that by a few years, so I sort of had to like ease into it. I think it came out alright, the inking was pretty solid too. They actually got me the inker I requested. So all in all, it was a pretty solid thing. And there's a few comics that came after this, as far as I know. They were not drawn by myself. I just drew the very first, because quite frankly, I quit after that. I quit making comic books for Top Cow. They did offer me some Microsoft game, I think Crimson Skies or something. I don't exactly remember which one it was, but I didn't want to do that anymore, so that was that. Number 3, and here comes the really controversial one, The Sword of Daikatana, or Daikatana. Now, we all know basically that Daikatana ended up being a huge bust, and back at the time when I was commissioned to do the comic book, that wasn't really that clear. I mean, I was familiar with John Romero, I was familiar obviously with Doom. The Masters of Doom book had not come out yet at this point, so I didn't read that yet, and I didn't know all the ins and outs and how Daikatana came to be. The only thing is that it was pimped to me like this was going to be the next big thing. And there was a real rush to it, I mean, ironically, when you read now, also like in John Romero's autobiography, The Doom Guy, which I highly recommend, basically, you see how long it took to get that game out. And it was literally one of those situations where they're like, well, you're gonna have to finish this comic over Easter, because Easter break, because it has to be out by that point. It's like after years of them lingering around with the comic and getting nowhere, with the game getting nowhere, and all of a sudden the comic had to be like done practically like over a weekend. The comic art, the art itself was okay, I mean, I think I did a pretty good job myself too on that, I don't have the book, unfortunately. I don't even think the book ever came out on its own. I saw it once at Borders Books or like Barnes and Nobles or something in a strategy guide. I wish I had bought the strategy guide at the time. They never sent me anything, so I don't have a hard copy of it. So all I have is a couple like inked pieces, which I've already sold, but I have some copies of. Number 2 is actually not really a video game, but is a game nonetheless that inspired a lot of video games. It's Magic the Gathering. Now, Magic the Gathering just started out when I was in art school. That was about 93, 94. And a lot of the kids were basically playing that in school. It was like the top game, and I was like, yeah, it looks kind of cool. You know, the art was really like sort of handmade, watercolory, kind of like the whole thing had sort of like a handmade kind of look to it. So it was kind of like charming. Then, like about a couple years later, Valiant Comics, you know, which I mentioned before, not being acclaimed yet at that point, they acquired the license for Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering really blown up basically, and of course, what is the logical, you know, conclusion when you have a card game with sort of like a lore? Yeah, well, you're gonna start making comics and deepen the lore. And I was commissioned to do 2 books in, I think it was the second wave of Magic. There were like 2 waves of each 4 series basically of Magic comics, and I was in the second wave. It's called The Legend of Jedid O'Shannon. It's about a tiger who fights basically for independence. Actually, I thought that was probably one of the better, story-wise also, books, and the artwork definitely stuck out. I think this is still, in hindsight, looking back the 20, 25, 30 years, is probably some of the better art that I've done on a commission book, because it was really super detailed. You will see in those examples that I'm showing you here, really super detailed, very ornate, like very fantastic. Also, an absolutely beautiful cover coloring by a guy named, I think Dave Clistic was his name. He would do like a lot of the Valiant comics at the time, and I think all in all, this came out really good. And the selling point, ironically, wasn't really the comic. The selling point of those comics was they came back with a super rare card. So with the Jedid O'Shannon comic, you would get a Jedid O'Shannon card. Jedid, that's, by the way, it's the tiger's name, Jedid. And you get like this tiger card with it, which then of course will be super rare, but I really don't think it sold too terribly well. You know, the feedback wasn't really that great, and they actually stopped doing those afterwards. The number 1 video game comic that I've worked on, and I would suppose you would probably agree with me, is probably also the best game out of the whole bunch, is Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. Now that game has sort of become like a cult favorite, and it even was back at the time. Matter of fact, I found out about it first, and my brother-in-law at the time was playing it religiously, and over the holidays, Thanksgivings and whatnot, he would come over and bring the console, and we would just play it basically. And when Top Cow offered me the job, I'm doing the first standalone Soul Reaver comic, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do a real bang-up job on this. Also coming off the heels of my comic book Kaos Moon, which is sort of like the super detailed fantasy kind of world, I sort of channeled it basically into that comic, and I think that came out really good. It was bundled, I think, with a Tomb Raider comic together. It was like a flip book, so the first side was like the Legacy of Kain, because it was only 16 pages. It wasn't a full 24-page book. It was only supposed to be a promotional 16-page book, and then they would have another 16 pages Tomb Raider comic on the other side. But the comic was extremely well received, and I think in terms of the artwork, of all commissioned artwork I've probably done in my career, it's probably the best. I also inked myself on that, you know, I mean, you can definitely tell, you know, so the drawing is super accurate, and especially if you look at the splash page, you know, I'm showing to you, and the accuracy basically of the character. You know, you gotta remember this is pre-internet, so I only had like the stuff to rely on that they gave me, and basically what I could, like, you know, gather from, you know, playing the actual, you know, game. And I think that came out pretty good, and it gave me quite a bit of acclaim. As a matter of fact, when I post this on Instagram, I got a lot of likes, and people are still commenting on it, you know, I mean, how it captured sort of like the essence. It's sort of interesting, considering the fact that I'm sort of like working in video games mostly now, doing my own indie games, and working on a Souls-like game, you know, sort of channeling those influences of, like, you know, Soul Reaver, Legacy of Kain, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, sorry, I have to say. So that is yeah, this is my history of the top 5 video games. I do have a little bonus here, and that's not like a super huge game. Years and years later, I was commissioned to do a webtoon for a game called Dino War by a company called Fun Plus. Now, it wasn't the most inspiring story, you know. I think I did some okay artwork on it, you know. I don't think they were too happy with it, but they let me do it anyway. The game kind of like came and went, and I think today you can download it as like a free app, but I don't think it really was like all that. But I think that's all I can remember, you know. Also, please follow this channel if you want to hear more devlogs or game-oriented content. I am pretty much like in the OG kind of like department. I don't work for anybody else. I'm doing like my own stuff. So if you're interested in finding out how do you start working on your own stuff from scratch, also tying it into animation and comics and just sort of like the whole transmedia aspect of it, you know, then please stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you back soon.